Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Historytime English. I am so glad you are here with me today. Take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and let this story carry you gently through time. Now, imagine you are standing on a small tropical island. The year is 1965. The air is hot and heavy. Around you, the streets are crowded and dirty. The buildings are old. The river runs through the center of the city, and it smells terrible. People and factories throw their waste into it. There is not enough clean water. There are not enough homes. Many families live together in tiny, dark rooms, sometimes 8 or 10 people sharing one small space. There is almost no industry, almost no army, and almost no natural resources, no oil, no minerals, not even enough fresh water for the people who live here. And yesterday, this island was told it was no longer welcome. It was pushed out, rejected, forced to become an independent country, whether it wanted to or not. The leader of this tiny island stood in front of television cameras and cried. He cried because he did not know how his people would survive. This is the story of Singapore. And what happened next is one of the most extraordinary transformations in human history. To understand how Singapore reached that desperate moment in 1965, we need to go back much further, hundreds of years, in fact. Singapore sits at the very bottom of the Malay Peninsula. The Malay Peninsula is a long, narrow piece of land. It stretches south from the continent of Asia toward the islands of Indonesia. It is a tiny island, just about 50 kilometers from east to west. You could drive across the entire country in less than an hour. But its position on the map is extraordinary. It sits right where the Indian Ocean meets the Pacific Ocean. This is along one of the busiest shipping routes in the world. Ships travel between China, Japan, and Korea in the east. And they travel to India, the Middle East, and Europe in the west. Almost every one of these ships passes through a narrow strip of water, and that strip of water is right next to Singapore. This strip of water is called the Strait of Malacca. Think of it as a doorway between two oceans, and Singapore sits right beside that door. For centuries, this made the island a natural meeting place. Traders from China, India, Arabia, and the islands of Southeast Asia stopped here to exchange goods. Small communities of fishermen and traders lived along the coast and up the river. The island had many names over the centuries, but the one that lasted came from a Malay legend. A prince from a nearby kingdom visited the island and saw a strange animal on the shore. He believed it was a lion. In Sanskrit, an ancient language of India, the word for lion is Simha, and the word for city is Pura. And so the island was named Singapura, the Lion City. In truth, there were probably no lions on the island. The animal the prince saw was most likely a tiger. But the name stayed, and it is a beautiful name. Singapura. Can you hear it? The Lion City. For hundreds of years, Singapore remained a small, quiet place. Fishermen caught fish. Traders came and went. The jungle covered most of the island. Nothing about it suggested that one day it would become one of the most important places on Earth. But then, in 1819, a man arrived who would change everything. His name was Stamford Raffles. He was a British official. He worked for the British East India Company. This was a powerful trading organization. It controlled much of the trade between Europe and Asia. Raffles was looking for a new port. He wanted a place where British ships could stop, rest, and trade. This was on the long journey between India and China. He needed a port in just the right position on the map. He needed a port that could compete with the Dutch. At that time, the Dutch controlled most of the other trading ports in the region. When Raffles saw Singapore, he immediately understood its power. The island's position was perfect. It sat right on the main shipping route. The water around it was deep enough for large ships, and almost nobody else controlled it. Raffles made an agreement with local leaders and declared Singapore a free port. A free port means that traders could buy and sell goods without paying extra taxes. This was a very clever move. When traders heard that Singapore charged no taxes, they came from everywhere. Ships from China, India, Britain, Arabia, and the islands of Southeast Asia filled the harbor. Within just a few years, Singapore grew from a small fishing village into a busy, noisy, crowded trading town. People came from all over Asia to find work and build new lives. Chinese workers came in large numbers, many from the south of China, looking for better opportunities. Indian workers came too, brought by the British to help build roads and buildings. Malay families who had lived in the region for generations stayed and grew. Arab traders set up businesses. The island became a place of many cultures. Many languages were spoken here. Many foods were cooked. Many religions were practiced. And all of this happened on one tiny piece of land. The British ruled Singapore for more than 100 years. They built government buildings, courts, and churches. They organized the city into different areas for different communities. They made English one of the official languages. Singapore became one of the most important ports in the British Empire. But then came a moment that changed everything. In 1942, during the Second World War, Japan invaded Singapore. The British believed Singapore was safe. They had built large guns along the coast. The guns pointed out to sea. They expected any attack to come from the water. But the Japanese army came through the jungle, from the north, from the land side. The British were completely surprised. After just 1 week of fighting, the British surrendered. It was one of the worst defeats in British military history. About 80,000 British and Allied soldiers were captured. For 3.5 years, the Japanese controlled Singapore. It was a dark and difficult time. When the war ended in 1945, the British returned. But something had changed in the hearts of the people. The British had promised to protect them, and they had failed. The people of Singapore began to ask a simple but powerful question. Why should someone on the other side of the world decide how we live? The desire for independence grew. In 1959, Singapore held its first full elections. A young lawyer named Lee Kuan Yew became the leader. He was 35 years old. He was sharp, determined, and not afraid to make difficult decisions. He believed that Singapore could govern itself. But there was a problem. Singapore was very small. Too small, many people believed. To survive as an independent country, it had no natural resources. It did not even have enough water. Almost all of its fresh water came through pipes. These pipes crossed the border from Malaysia. Malaysia is the large country to the north. Lee Kuan Yew believed that Singapore needed to join Malaysia to survive. And in 1963, Singapore merged with Malaysia, becoming part of a larger country. But the marriage did not last. There were deep disagreements between the leaders of Singapore and the leaders of Malaysia. They argued about economics, about race, about power. The arguments grew worse and worse. And on the 9th of August, 1965, Malaysia told Singapore to leave. Singapore was expelled, pushed out, forced to become independent. This was the moment when Lee Kuan Yew cried on television. He was not crying from happiness. He was crying because he believed his people were in danger. Singapore had no army. It had no resources. It had almost no fresh water of its own. Many countries around the world thought Singapore would fail. Some thought it would come begging to rejoin Malaysia within a year. A tiny island, with no land, no oil, and barely enough water. How could it possibly survive? But Lee Kuan Yew and his team refused to give up. They made a decision that would define Singapore's future. If Singapore had no natural resources, then its people would become the resource. Education would be the foundation of everything. The government built schools across the island. Every child had to go to school. Education was not optional. It was the law. Children learned mathematics, science, and English. English was chosen as the main language of education. This was not because the people wanted to forget their own languages. It was because English was the language of international business. If Singapore wanted to trade with the world, its people needed to speak the language of the world. The government also made Singapore one of the easiest places in the world to start a business. They cut taxes for foreign companies. They built factories and industrial areas. They made their laws clear and fair. They fought corruption, which means the dishonest use of power for personal gain. In many countries at that time, corruption was a normal part of business. In Singapore, it was punished severely. This made foreign companies trust Singapore. If you built a factory in Singapore, you knew the rules would be followed. You knew your investment was safe. And companies came. From America, from Europe, from Japan. They built factories. They created jobs. Money began to flow into the tiny island. The government also solved the water problem. Remember, almost all of Singapore's fresh water came from Malaysia through pipes. This was dangerous. If Malaysia ever decided to turn off the water, Singapore would be in serious trouble. So the government built huge systems to collect rainwater. They built plants that cleaned used water and made it safe to drink again. This recycled water is called NEWater. They also built machines that turn seawater into fresh water. This process is called desalination. Desalination means removing the salt from ocean water. Today, Singapore can produce much of its own water. The tiny island that once depended on its neighbor for every drop of water now controls its own supply. At the same time, the government transformed the physical appearance of the country. They cleaned the river. The Singapore River was once so dirty that nothing could live in it. Workers cleaned it over many years. Slowly, the water became clear again. They built thousands of public apartments, called Housing Development Board flats, or HDB flats. Today, about 80% of Singapore's population lives in these government-built homes. The government did not just build homes. They made sure that people from different races and backgrounds lived together in the same buildings. Chinese families lived next to Malay families. Indian families lived next to everyone else. This was done on purpose to prevent the kind of division and conflict that had torn Singapore apart from Malaysia. They planted trees everywhere. Millions of trees. Singapore became known as a garden city. They built parks and nature reserves on an island where space was more precious than gold. They even created new land. Singapore today is about 25% larger than it was in 1965. How? The government added new land. They filled in parts of the sea with sand and earth. They literally made the country bigger. The results were extraordinary. In 1965, Singapore's income per person was similar to the poorest countries in Africa. By the year 2000, just 35 years later, Singapore's income per person was higher than most countries in Europe. Today, it is one of the richest countries in the world. Its airport, Changi Airport, is regularly voted the best airport on Earth. It has a waterfall inside the building, 4 stories tall, surrounded by a garden of trees and flowers. Visitors sometimes go to the airport just to see it, even if they are not flying anywhere. Its port is one of the busiest in the world. Its schools rank among the best in the world in mathematics and science. The streets are clean and safe. People from more than 100 different countries live and work together on this tiny island. Think about that for a moment. In one generation, Singapore changed completely. Think of the short time between a grandfather and his grandchild. In 1965, many people lived in poverty. The river was full of waste. The country had no army and no water. And in that same short time, Singapore became one of the cleanest, safest, and wealthiest nations on Earth. Of course, the story is not simple. Lee Kuan Yew ruled Singapore for 31 years, from 1959 to 1990. Under his leadership, The country was not a full democracy in the way that some Western countries understand the word. The government controlled the press. Political opposition was weak. Some people criticized Singapore for being too strict, for having too many rules, for punishing small crimes harshly. There is a famous rule in Singapore: chewing gum is banned. People sometimes laugh about this, but behind the jokes, there is a real debate. How much freedom should a government give its people? And how much order does a society need? Lee Kuan Yew always had the same answer. He said that Singapore was too small, too vulnerable, and too diverse to afford chaos. He believed that discipline and order mattered more than total freedom. A tiny, fragile country, he said, could not afford anything else. Not everyone agreed with him, but almost everyone agreed on one thing. What Singapore achieved was remarkable. And so, my friend, the story of Singapore comes gently to its end. It is a story about a place that had nothing and built everything. A fishing village that became a world city. A tiny island that was told it could not survive. And then it became one of the most successful countries on earth. Not because it had oil under the ground or gold in the mountains, but because it invested in the one thing it did have: its people, their minds, their effort, their willingness to learn. And you, my friend, you are doing the same thing right now. You are investing in yourself. Every time you listen to a story like this one, every time you learn a new word, every time you understand a sentence that once seemed impossible, you are building something. You are building your own Singapore. You are taking something small, a single word, a single sentence, and you are turning it into something powerful. It does not matter where you started. It does not matter how small your beginning was. What matters is that you keep building, keep learning, keep growing. This is Historytime English. If the story of Singapore moved you today, please leave a comment. Tell me, what stayed with you most? Was it the moment Lee Kuan Yew cried on television because he did not know if his country would survive? The fact that Singapore has no natural resources except its people? Or the way a tiny island proved the whole world wrong? I would love to hear from you. There are many more stories waiting right here, and I will be here when you come back. Until next time, my friend, take care of yourself and never stop learning.